I remember the sound first, not the kind one usually associates with death, but the faint, deliberate murmur of the chapel organ struggling through its last refrain. The notes seemed to falter, uncertain of their own existence, before being swallowed by the silence that descends upon Oxford in winter. There was frost that morning on the window-sill of my flat in North Oxford, a crystalline bloom that caught the first grey light. I stood watching it melt as if it were performing some minor act of courage. Perhaps that is why I took the call. Lewis's voice came through the receiver, muffled by distance and resignation. An organist had been found dead in St. Aldhelm's Chapel, a name that meant little to him, but too much to me. I had attended a recital there once, years ago, when the world had seemed both narrower and more possible. A young man had played Bach with such quiet precision that one could hear the dust stirring on the hymn books. Now, apparently, that same man was cold and still. By the time we arrived, the frost had thickened. The chapel stood as if carved from the same substance, its spire glinting faintly, its doors sealed against warmth or intrusion. Inside, a handful of people hovered like guilty thoughts, the dean, the choir master, a porter, each trying not to look at the covered figure by the vestry door. The air smelled faintly of incense and gas, an unholy combination. Lewis muttered something about faulty pipes, but I had already noticed the open hymn book on the organ. It was turned to abide with me, though the program from the previous night listed Jesu, joy of man's desiring. A small discrepancy, easily explained by habit or sentiment, yet the pages were damp, as if someone had turned them with a trembling, unsteady hand. I leaned closer, tracing the faint indentation of a pencil mark beneath the title, Forgive the Silence. Not a hymn line, not even scriptural. I tore the corner from my notebook and made a note of it. Lewis was talking to the dean. I caught fragments. The man had been alone after the recital. Stayed behind to lock up, no sign of forced entry. The gas heater in the vestry had been temperamental for years. The kind of thing that happens, said the dean. I suppose it is, I replied, though not often during Advent. He didn't laugh. Few people do when I attempt levity. Outside, the light had begun to change, a thin thread of silver creeping through the stained glass. It caught on the frost of the windowsill near the altar, outlining something small, a folded sheet of paper tucked between the stone and the frame. I pulled it free. Music notation, faintly penciled, the melody incomplete. Only a few bars, then a sudden stop, as if the composer had run out of breath or hope. Lewis peered over my shoulder. Looks like part of the service, he said. Perhaps, I murmured, though I knew it wasn't. The handwriting leaned left too hesitant, too personal for liturgical formality. I folded it carefully, slipped it into my coat. When we stepped outside, the sky was beginning to flake with snow, the sort that makes sound feel muted and private. I thought of the man at the organ, his fingers slowing, the air thickening with fumes, the world narrowing to a single frozen chord. Accidents have a way of arranging themselves too neatly in Oxford. The city dislikes untidy deaths. Lewis asked if we were finished. I told him yes, though I knew we weren't. Something in that chapel had been composed for silence, and someone had decided to conduct it to its end. The frost still clung to the window-sill when we left, undisturbed, as if waiting for a warmer truth to melt it. There are mornings when Oxford appears to wake reluctantly, as if reluctant to acknowledge its own ghosts. That was one such morning. I walked from the station toward the college through a mist that clung like memory, softening the stone and dimming the spires. Somewhere beyond the fog, the bells of St. Aldhelm's told the half-hour, a slow, uncertain chime, like a man hesitating to confess. Lewis had brought the early report. Carbon monoxide poisoning. The coroner's preliminary verdict was accidental, the sort of tidy conclusion that administrators find comforting. I read it while stirring cold tea, tracing the word accidental with my thumb until the ink bled. A death without intention always seems to satisfy everyone except me. When we returned to the chapel, the air was colder than before, as if the stone itself disapproved of our intrusion. The hymn books lay neatly stacked, their black spines unbroken. The organ loomed in the half-light, mute, its keys veiled in dust. Only the faintest trace of wax on the floor betrayed that there had been music here at all. Lewis wandered toward the vestry, speaking softly with the verger. I examined the order of service pinned to the notice board. A familiar list Magnificat, Psalm 24, Nunc dimittis, Jesu joy of man's desiring. The last entry caught my eye not because of what it said, but because of what it didn't. Someone had written, then carefully erased, another title beneath it. The faint impression remained. I leaned close until the letters revealed themselves in the grain of the paper. O come, Emmanuel. It was an Advent hymn, perfectly ordinary in itself. Yet I recalled the choir director's insistence the previous evening that it had been struck from the program. She had said it carried unfortunate connotations about the verse being unsuitable this year. I remembered her tone more than her brittle words, like a glass too long under tension. In the vestry, Lewis found a small stack of letters. They had been sent to the deceased by the college's music society notices, invitations, and routine correspondence. But one envelope stood apart, addressed in a delicate, looping hand. No return address. Inside was a single scrap of paper with a line from the Psalms, "Out of the depths have I cried unto thee, O Lord." Beneath it, the faint trace of musical notation, as if someone had begun to set the verse to melody and thought better of it. Lewis asked what I made of it. I told him nothing yet. He said the gas heater had been inspected only last month. No fault found. He used the phrase twice, as though repetition could make it true. I sat on one of the pews, the cold of the wood pressing through my coat. The silence of the chapel was different today, not merely absence of sound, but an expectancy, as though something unsaid lingered between the stones. I looked again at the erased hymn title. Advent, waiting, longing for redemption. Perhaps the choice of music had not been a matter of theology at all. When we left, the mist had thickened to a fine drizzle. Lewis walked ahead, his footsteps making small, hollow sounds on the flagstones. I paused under the archway and looked back at the chapel. A light still burned in the vestry window, flickering unevenly. It could have been a drought, or it could have been the last breath of something unresolved, still singing where no one should. Later that night, over a glass of whiskey, I unfolded the psalm fragment again. The handwriting troubled me not for what it revealed, but for what it tried to conceal. The first letters of each bar formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. MH, two initials, faint as breath against glass. I wrote them in my notebook, underlined once, and left the rest to the silence. The Dean of St. Aldhelm's was a man of cultivated restraint, the sort whose faith expressed itself not in warmth but in symmetry. His study smelled of polish and old sermons. The air felt too clean, as though confession had been replaced by furniture wax. He rose when Lewis and I entered, his hands clasped behind his back like a man shielding something fragile. He spoke softly about the tragedy, choosing words as if each one might later be quoted at a memorial. The organist had been part of the college family, a devoted servant, a man of whom he paused, some peculiar sensitivities. The euphemism hung in the room like incense that refused to disperse. Lewis asked about the gas installation. The dean replied with rehearsed assurance the pipes had been replaced 3 weeks prior, all inspected by competent men. His tone left no space for doubt. I noticed the faint tremor in his right hand when he reached for his teacup, a minute vibration that contradicted the stillness of his voice. On the mantel stood a photograph, slightly tilted. 3 figures in choir robes, standing in front of the chapel, the organist, the choir director, Dr. Bracken, and a young woman with a half-smile. The name on the brass frame read, Margaret Halcombe, 1987 choral scholar. I asked about her. The dean's eyes lowered to the carpet. A brilliant student, he murmured, but fragile. She left Oxford suddenly, circumstances unfortunate. I asked whether the organist had known her well. He said nothing, which was itself an answer. When the conversation began to loop, I asked about the cellar. It was an idle question, or seemed so. Every college has one, filled with damp archives, broken chairs, and forgotten bottles. The dean's hesitation was barely perceptible, but it existed. He said the cellar was used only for storage, though the key, curiously, was on his own ring. He offered to show it to us, out of transparency. The descent was narrow, the stone steps uneven, the air thick with dust and a faint mineral tang. A single bulb flickered above the doorway. Rows of wooden crates lined the walls, old communion wine, candle wax, boxed hymnals. Lewis busied himself examining ledgers while I studied the bottles. Most were the usual college vintage serviceable claret, unambitious sherry, but one crate was different. The labels bore a year I recognized at once, 1987. The same year Margaret Halcombe vanished. The corks had not been touched. When I asked if these had been ordered for a particular event, the dean's answer came too swiftly. A cancelled dinner, a donor's illness. Nothing of importance. Lewis, with his practical steadiness, pointed out that the ledger listed the crate as missing stock. I said nothing. Some truths are best left to ripen in silence. The dean smiled, a controlled contraction of the mouth, and led us back upstairs. As we stepped into the cloister, I caught a reflection in the glass door, his face pale and slightly distorted by the old pane. He was watching the cellar door behind us, not me. When I turned, he quickly adjusted his gaze, remarking on the weather that peculiar British instinct to bury discomfort beneath meteorology. We left him standing in the quadrangle. The winter sun pressed faint shadows through the archways, and I thought of the unopened bottles below, waiting in the dark, preserving something more potent than wine. Later, at Randolph, over a reluctant pint, I opened my notebook. Under the heading Halcombe, 1987, I drew a single arrow from the name to one word cellar. Beneath it, I wrote another, silence. It seemed to me that the two were intimately acquainted. The following afternoon carried a pale, brittle light, the kind Oxford saves for its half-forgotten corners. I walked through the cloister toward the chapel, the sound of choir practice leaking faintly into the quadrangle. The notes, pure and ascending, might have seemed angelic to anyone less suspicious by nature. To me, they carried a tremor and hesitation between bars, as if truth itself had been poorly rehearsed. Lewis was already inside, notebook open, speaking with one of the tenors. A nervous lad, all angles and anxiety. He said they'd been practicing Ave Verum Corpus when they heard the organ that night, someone playing long before the official rehearsal, around 4 o'clock. It wasn't the usual hymn. It was softer, slower, something mournful. I asked if he recognized the tune. He shook his head, though his eyes betrayed the effort of pretending not to remember. When he left, I sat at the rear pew facing the choir. Director. Dr. Celia Bracken conducted with the precision of a surgeon and the warmth of an autopsy. Her baton rose and fell like punctuation to an unspoken confession. When she finished, she approached me with the briskness of someone who detests interruptions. She said the college had suffered enough gossip that the organist's death was a private misfortune, not a mystery. I told her misfortunes rarely write unsigned letters quoting psalms. Her face didn't move, but her fingers tightened around the baton. Lewis returned with a small stack of programs. Each listed the same order of hymns except for one copy printed differently, with O Come, Emmanuel restored to its rightful place. I turned it over. On the back, someone had written 2 words in pencil for M. I slipped it into my coat. A moment later, a boy from the choir asked if he might fetch his satchel from the vestry. I watched him walk down the aisle, his footsteps echoing faintly against the tiles. There was a tremor in the sound, not from fear, but guilt. It struck me then that lies, like harmonies, rely on timing. Too soon, and the dissonance betrays itself. When the choir dispersed, I wandered up to the gallery. The scent of polish and candle smoke lingered. On the organ stand lay a metronome, ticking idly. I stopped it, then noticed something underneath a letter opener, shaped like a quill, its tip dulled from use. Engraved on its handle were the initials M.H. I held it to the light, feeling a faint chill. Margaret Halcombe's name again, surfacing from the past like a half-forgotten refrain. Lewis found me there and asked if I believed in coincidence. I told him Oxford runs on misplaced books, misheard hymns, misread intentions. But this felt too deliberate, like a symphony modulating toward a key it was never meant to reach. He asked if I thought the organist had been blackmailed. I said perhaps, or perhaps he was simply haunted by his own music. We stepped out into the quadrangle. Evening had crept in unnoticed. The bells began their slow toll, counting something we could neither see nor amend. I turned back toward the chapel. Through its windows, the light trembled on the glass, and for a moment it looked as if the figures inside were still singing. Only later did I realize what had unsettled me most. The rhythm of their voices had faltered precisely where the erased hymn would have begun. I made a note of a pause, a silence, an omission. Sometimes the truest confession is the verse no one dares to sing. The college library at dusk is a place where even the air seems to whisper. Dust drifts like faded thought, settling softly over the shelves as if reluctant to disturb the silence of scholarship. I had come not for books, but for ghosts. The porter had mentioned that the library kept a photographic archive of its former choirs, an idle remark, perhaps, but one that clung to me like a loose thread. The librarian, a thin woman with the demeanor of someone perpetually listening to a distant ticking clock, led me to the back room. She said the photographs had been catalogued only loosely by volunteers, undergraduate projects, and forgotten enthusiasts. The smell of old paper and developer fluid hung in the air, faintly medicinal. She left me there, alone with the quiet hum of the radiators and a single desk lamp haloed in dust. Most of the images were unremarkable, earnest young men in robes, frozen smiles, names scrawled on the reverse in faded ink. Then, in the middle of the pile, one photograph stopped me. The choir of 1987. The organist in the center, younger, more alive, the faint arrogance of the talented stamped across his face. To his right, Celia Bracken, her expression unreadable, and beside her, Margaret Halcombe, her smile small and deliberate, like someone guarding a secret. But it wasn't the faces that held me. It was the composition of a hand, half visible on Margaret's shoulder, though no one stood close enough to claim it. The gesture seemed protective, almost possessive. I lifted the photograph to the lamp. In the margin, faint pencil marks Vox Clementis in Deserto, the voice crying in the wilderness. Isaiah, yes. But also, I recalled, the title of a banned dissertation once written by the organist himself, a work on musical theology, withdrawn after an internal complaint. Lewis appeared in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee that smelled faintly of burnt paper. He asked what I'd found. I showed him the photograph. He squinted, unimpressed, and said it looked like a trick of the light. Perhaps it was. But I noticed the hand again, pale against Margaret's dark gown, and thought of the erased hymn, the missing verse, the silence that lingered beneath the chapel's winter air. When Lewis left, I studied the photograph once more. Beneath the inscription was a small blot of ink, shaped almost like a note, a quaver or a tear, depending on one's sentimentality. The librarian returned, saying she'd found something else, an envelope addressed to the college warden, never posted. Inside was a typewritten sheet, an inventory of choir members, annotated by hand. Next to Margaret's name, someone had written a single word gone. I slipped the photograph and the list into my folder, promising to return them later. As I walked through the dark corridor, the portraits of long-dead deans watched me with a familiarity I couldn't reciprocate. Their faces, though fixed, seemed to understand the peculiar ache of memory, how truth in Oxford never disappears, only rearranges itself. Outside, the first snow had begun to fall. The light from the chapel windows trembled faintly, the same pale glow reflected in the glass of the photograph I carried. I paused beneath an archway and looked at it one last time. The ink inscription, the strange hand, the poised expression of the woman who had vanished all seemed to hum together like notes from a forgotten hymn. At that moment, I understood that the past rarely dies quietly here. It waits, catalogued but unfiled, beneath the dust and Latin mottos, a voice still crying, unheard, in its wilderness of stone. I heard it again that evening, faintly, as we crossed the quad. A melody carried on the wind from the chapel, ghostly in its persistence. Lewis said it was probably the students rehearsing for evensong, but I knew better. The phrasing was wrong for liturgy, too intimate, too human. It drifted in fragments, like something written to be remembered, but not repeated. We went inside. The choir had long dispersed, yet the air still held the residue of music. I walked the length of the nave, listening. Each step seemed to release another note, the acoustics of the place behaving like a conscience. Lewis followed, dutifully silent, while I traced my finger along the pews, feeling the faint grooves of initials carved by generations who mistook eternity for boredom. The organ stood silent, though a few sheets of music remained scattered on its stand. One bore a hand-drawn staff line, unevenly inked, with the faint ghost of a familiar rhythm. I whistled the bars under my breath and stopped. It was not a hymn at all, but the refrain from an old Oxford ballad under winter's arch. A song about clandestine meetings, about a woman who waits beneath the chapel walls for a lover who never returns. I had heard it years ago, late at night in the Randolph bar, sung by a cellist who claimed it was based on truth. Lewis asked if it meant anything. I told him it might, though what it meant I wasn't yet ready to admit, even to myself. The song was a confession disguised as folklore, and confessions tend to repeat themselves across generations. He found a stack of receipts beside the organ stool. Gas refills, tuning fees, hymn book orders, all ordinary, until one entry caught my eye, private rehearsal, December 3rd, 7 p.m. That was the night before the death. No witnesses, no reason to rehearse alone, unless, of course, he wasn't alone. We went to the vestry. The air still smelled faintly of paraffin and polish. On the desk, a candle had melted into an odd shape, the wax curling around itself like frozen smoke. It struck me that the organist must have lit it deliberately, not for prayer, but for company. I bent closer and saw a smudge of lipstick on the rim of the glass holder. Pale rose, unlikely to have been his. Lewis frowned, saying perhaps a visitor had left it during the recital. I told him visitors rarely bring their own candles. As we left, I stopped by the side aisle, where a tapestry of the Nativity hung, faded and heavy with dust. A single thread had come loose, dangling across the Virgin's face. I tugged it gently and found it anchored to a small pin behind the frame of a note, folded twice. Inside, a fragment of a handwriting, "Meet me before the last verse." I said nothing to Lewis. The words felt too personal to share, too carefully chosen to be random. I placed the paper in my coat, the weight of it almost imperceptible, yet unshakable. Outside, the snow had started again, the flakes swirling like confetti for a ceremony no one attended. Lewis asked if I thought the organist had written the note. I said perhaps he had composed the tune, but not the silence that followed. Back at my flat, long after midnight, I poured a measure of whiskey and played the melody softly on the gramophone, matching the remembered tune to what I had heard in the chapel. The notes fell into place, hesitant but inevitable. It was a love song, yes, but also a warning. Somewhere between the bars, a pause too deliberate to be accidental, I let the record spin out, the final chord fading into nothing. In Oxford, even silence can hum if you listen long enough. The storm had broken by the time we reached the college. Rain slanted through the cloister in restless diagonals, drumming on the stone like fingers tapping out an unanswered thought. Lewis, ever the pragmatist, cursed softly and pulled up his collar. I said nothing. The air had that strange stillness that follows discovery, the sort of quiet that knows what it's concealing. A clerk from maintenance waited for us near the chapel steps, holding a folder spotted with rain. He said he'd found something while sorting the old gas repair invoices. Not a receipt this time, but a scrap of paper tucked between the pages, brittle, yellowed, folded once. He handed it to me with a reluctance that verged on reverence. I opened it carefully. A torn sheet of music, not from the printed hymnals, but written in pencil, the notation faint yet deliberate. Beneath the stave, in Latin, 4 words et in silentio confessus sum. And in silence, I confessed, it was the missing verse, the one Bracken had denied ever existed. I folded it and slipped it into my coat, ignoring Lewis's question. Some things lose their meaning the moment they're spoken aloud. We found her in the chapel, seated alone beneath the lectern, hands clasped as if in prayer. Dr. Bracken did not look surprised to see us. The light from the high window haloed her hair in a way that might have seemed almost holy, were it not for the faint tremor in her breathing. I held the page toward her. She didn't touch it. She said she hadn't written it, though her voice suggested otherwise. I told her it wasn't a question. There was a pause, then one of those long, delicate silences Oxford excels at, filled with the sound of memory rearranging itself. She said the organist had been composing something private, a meditation perhaps, and that the verse was his attempt to reconcile sin with art. Her explanation was measured, academic. I wanted to believe it. But I noticed the dust on the floor beside her pew, faint footprints leading toward the vestry, small, narrow, unmistakably feminine. Lewis followed my gaze, then turned away, unwilling to see what I had already seen. I asked her when she last entered that room. She smiled, a gesture without warmth, and said, "Perhaps last week, perhaps last night. What difference did it make?" The tone of someone who has stopped distinguishing between truth and comfort. When we left, the rain had deepened to mist. Lewis muttered that he couldn't tell whether she was lying. I told him that honesty and guilt often wear the same expression, and that we might learn more from what people withhold than from what they confess. He didn't answer. Back at the station, I spread the music fragment on my desk beside the earlier psalm line. The handwriting was similar, but not identical to the same hand, perhaps, grown shakier or written in haste. The melody followed the same contour as the ballad I'd heard in the chapel, yet the rhythm faltered halfway through, a stumble between notes, as if the composer had paused for breath or regret. I traced the pencil markings, connecting the bar lines until they formed a pattern, not of sound, but of intent. The missing verse was not meant to be sung. It was an admission disguised as composition, and like all confessions worth making, it had been torn from something larger, perhaps, from the conscience of the living. I leaned back, listening to the rain against the window, steady, rhythmic, faithful. It struck me then that silence was not the absence of truth, but its echo, the sound left behind when everything else has been said. That night, as I closed my notebook, the Latin phrase still lingered at the edge of thought, unresolved, like the last chord of a hymn the choir never finished. It was Lewis who found her, or rather, found the trace of her. A letter forwarded from a parish in Cornwall, the kind written on thick paper by someone who hasn't forgotten how to use a fountain pen. The vicar enclosed a note, polite, uncertain, saying the woman had asked him never to mention Oxford, but he thought the police should know she was alive. Margaret Halcombe. The name had begun to echo through the case like a half-heard melody that refused to fade. The journey south was long and subdued. Lewis drove, muttering about the weather and the state of the roads, while I stared out at the landscape dissolving into mist. Somewhere beyond the window lay the sea that is an endless metaphor for the things we choose to bury. When we arrived, the village seemed made entirely of grey slate roofs, shingle paths, clouds pressing low enough to be mistaken for thought. She lived in a converted boathouse overlooking the cove. A faint smell of salt and old varnish lingered in the air, mingled with something floral. She opened the door before we could knock, as if she had been listening for us. Her hair had lost the brightness I remembered from the photograph in the library, but her eyes retained that curious stillness, not fear exactly, but distance. She invited us in. The interior was spare. Precise books arranged by size, a piano against the wall, an unfinished painting turned to face the corner. I asked if she knew why we'd come. She said she supposed. It was about him, the organist. Her tone held neither affection nor bitterness, only weariness. She told us, slowly, that once there had been love or something mistaken for it between them. He had been brilliant, charming, ambitious, all the things a young woman might confuse with virtue. He had promised her a composition, a piece that would make her immortal. Instead, he took her melody, reshaped it, and called it his own. She had discovered the theft when it was too late. A letter from the publishers, a congratulatory note addressed to him, not her. The betrayal had been as elegant as it was complete. I asked if she confronted him. She said she had, in the chapel one evening after rehearsal. She remembered the candles, the echo of their argument beneath the arches, the way he refused to look at her. Then she left Oxford that same night, never to return. When I asked why she hadn't spoken sooner, she smiled faintly. "Because confession is only admired after the crime," she said. Lewis asked about the hymn, the one that shouldn't have been sung. She turned toward the piano and struck a few notes, hesitant, uncertain before stopping. The sound was unmistakably the same phrase I'd heard in the chapel, the tune that had haunted the investigation. She said it had been her melody once, meant to accompany a psalm about forgiveness. He'd altered it, slowed it down, and in doing so had made it unbearable. She hadn't touched the keys since. Before we left, I noticed a letter lying half concealed beneath a sheet of music. The handwriting was familiar to him. I asked if she'd kept it intentionally. She said she'd meant to burn it, but somehow couldn't. The edges were singed, the ink blurred, as though caught between destruction and memory. When we stepped back into the cold air, Lewis said he pitied her. I told him pity was often a disguise for guilt. We stood for a moment watching the tide recede, the sea pulling the sand into patterns too intricate to last. That night, back in Oxford, I opened my notebook and wrote a single sentence. A song once stolen will always sound unfinished. Then I underlined it, twice, as the wind pressed against the window steady, insistent, like the rhythm of a confession finally finding its voice. It was Lewis who noticed the small brass plate beneath the chapel's postbox, half obscured by centuries of polish and neglect. I had walked past it a dozen times without thought, preoccupied with the living. The plate read, "Post Temporis," after time. A strange choice for a college mailbox, though Oxford has never lacked for irony. The porter said it hadn't been opened in decades, not since the postal service insisted on efficiency over ritual, which meant, of course, that it was precisely where one should look for something never meant to be found. We returned that afternoon, armed with a key borrowed and a conscience borrowed further still. The rain had begun again, the steady kind that erases footprints but not guilt. The hinges resisted before yielding with a hollow sigh. Inside, beneath a century's worth of dust and brittle envelopes, lay a single letter. The parchment was yellowed, the edges chewed by damp. Its seal, once crimson, had faded to brown. I lifted it gently, and for a moment the smell of gas rose faintly from it, or imagination supplied what memory required. The handwriting was his. I knew it before reading the name. The organist had addressed it to Margaret Halcombe. I read aloud while Lewis stood beside me, silent. It was a confession, though not the kind absolution entertains. He wrote of guilt and plagiarism, of love misunderstood and sins unmeasured. He spoke of silence as both punishment and prayer. But then, at the bottom, came another hand sharper, more deliberate, almost corrective. It said, "It was you who made her vanish." Lewis frowned. 2 hands, 2 truths. I asked him to fetch the earlier documents. Bracken's choir notes, the music fragment, and the erased hymn copy. Spread across the pew, they looked less like evidence and more like the pages of a requiem. I studied the ink, the slant, and the hesitation between strokes. The addition to the letter had been written by the same hand that corrected the Latin in the missing verse. Bracken's. She had found the letter, read it, and chosen to revise guilt as though editing a manuscript. I imagined her kneeling here one night, whispering forgiveness to a stone that could not answer. Lewis said it proved everything. I told him it proved nothing except that remorse needs an audience, and Oxford always provides one, even if it's carved in granite. Still, there was something else, a detail I couldn't quite name. The seal, not wax, but resin, translucent, as if mixed with something foreign. I scraped a flake between my fingers. It left a faint scent, sweet and chemical candle varnish, perhaps, from the very candles Bracken used in the choir stalls, which meant she hadn't just read the letter. She had sealed it again, preserved the confession like a relic, and warned both. We left it where we found it. Lewis wanted to catalogue it as evidence, but I told him the dead had earned their privacy. Outside, the rain had turned to sleet, hissing softly against the chapel stone. He asked what would happen to Bracken. I said perhaps nothing. Perhaps that was the point. Punishment, like music, depends on interpretation. Later, in my room, I laid the letter beneath the lamplight. The 2 handwritings seemed to converse across time, one pleading, one condemning. Between them, a space of silence that neither could cross. I traced the Latin phrase again, post temporis, after time. Perhaps that was where all confessions belonged, beyond the reach of comprehension, in the stillness after the last note had faded. When I closed my notebook that night, I could still smell the faint tang of varnish on my fingers, and it struck me that the truth, like resin, hardens not to protect, but to preserve the shape of what once was soft. The choir assembled that evening under a sky the color of unpolished pewter. No conductor, no program, only the quiet insistence of tradition. I sat near the back of the chapel, half listening, half watching, as voices rose and wavered like smoke from an extinguished candle. Each note seemed to search for something it had already lost. Dr. Bracken was absent. The dean claimed illness, but even he didn't believe it. The organ stood mute, its polished keys reflecting the low light like teeth. Lewis shifted beside me, uncomfortable in the silence between hymns. He asked if we should call it finished. I said no. Not yet. Music, like guilt, has a way of lingering past its performance. They began Jesu joy of man's desiring, though no one led them in. It faltered immediately, the sopranos unsure, the tenors hesitant. But as the melody gathered, something in it steadied. I recognized the pattern as a modification of the missing verse, disguised within Bach's familiar shape. Someone had rewritten the end, a confession, transformed into harmony. When it was over, the dean gave a benediction so brief it barely qualified his speech. The choir dispersed slowly, uncertain whether the service had ended or merely paused. I walked toward the vestry, Lewis trailing behind, saying nothing but thinking loudly. The gas heater had been replaced. New fittings, new pipes, a sharp scent of varnish and soap. Yet the walls still held the shadow of what had happened. A smudge where the candle once burned too long, a patch of stone faintly discolored. On the table lay a folded robe, neatly pressed, as though waiting for a return that would never come. In its pocket, a small wooden cross, the string frayed, the grain darkened by touch. I recognized it from the photograph, the one Margaret had worn around her neck. I turned it over and saw an inscription, barely visible. "Forgive the silence." Lewis asked what it meant. I told him it meant precisely what it said. He wanted to arrest Bracken, but she was already gone. Her rooms stood empty. The college secretary said she'd resigned that morning. No forwarding address, only a note for the dean, let the hymn end where it began. We left the chapel without speaking. The evening had turned to mist, and the quad shimmered under the half-light of the lamps. Students hurried past, laughing, unaware that the air they breathed still carried fragments of an unfinished requiem. Back in my flat, I poured a whiskey and listened to the recording Lewis had made during the service. The choir's unsteady voices filled the room, wavering between devotion and exhaustion. Midway through, a single soprano broke from the others, her tone trembling, almost human in its imperfection. She lingered half a beat longer on the final word. A name disguised as praise. Margaret. I replayed it twice, then stopped. Perhaps I imagined it. Perhaps I wanted to. Oxford thrives on ambiguity. It makes sin feel academic, and redemption sound like theory. In the stillness, I found myself thinking of Bracken, her composure, her solitude, her fatal tidiness. She had rewritten the hymn, loosened the pipe, sealed the letter, directed the silence. A choir without a conductor, indeed, yet one still following her unspoken hand. Outside, the bells began their slow descent into midnight, each toll dissolving into the next. I sat listening until the sound grew faint, then vanished altogether. For a moment, I thought I heard a melody beneath the last chime, the same one from that first evening, played now with perfect calm. It ended as it must, not with revelation, but with rest. The choir's silence seemed almost merciful. I raised the glass and whispered the word that came unbidden, Amen. There are endings that do not arrive so much as fade, like candle smoke curling into the vault of a chapel. That morning, I returned alone to St. Aldhelm's. The snow had thickened overnight, muting the city's usual hum, and Oxford lay beneath a blanket of reluctant forgiveness. The gates were locked, but the porter recognized me and said nothing. He simply handed me the key. Inside, the cold was absolutely not the kind that bites, but the kind that waits. The air tasted of dust and hymn wax. I moved through the nave slowly, my footsteps dull against the stone. The last light of morning pressed through the stained glass, bleeding color onto the floor gold, red, blue, all fading toward gray. At the front pew, a folded note lay beside the hymnal. I had almost missed it. For whoever listens last, it said. The handwriting was Bracken's small, measured, certain style. I didn't open it at once. Instead, I sat where she must have sat the night before she left, perhaps replaying the melody in her mind, perhaps forgiving herself by degrees. When I finally unfolded it, the message was brief. He wanted silence. I gave it to him. The rest is only music. Nothing more. No apology, no confession, only that haunting logic the human heart calls mercy. I replaced the letter and looked toward the organ. It stood empty now, its pipes catching faint sunlight. I pressed one key out of habit, middle C, and the note emerged faintly, wavering as if reluctant to disturb the air. Then it died, and in its place came a stillness so complete it seemed almost sentient. Lewis arrived later, breath visible in the cold. He asked if there was anything left to find. I told him we never find the right things, only the ones that remain. He stood quietly beside me, hands in pockets, staring up at the chancel arch. I think he felt the same unease I did, that peculiar ache that accompanies understanding when it's too late to matter. Outside, a bell struck 9. The sound shivered through the windows, through us, through the dust that trembled on the ledges. Lewis asked if I believed she had killed him. I said I believed she had finished his sentence. He frowned, as he often did when words refused to obey logic. Then he nodded once, and we left it there. We walked the quad in silence. Snow gathered in the creases of the stone carvings, in the mouths of angels, and along the spines of Latin inscriptions. I stopped by the chapel door, turned once more, and saw through the frost-blurred glass what looked like the shadow of a figure seated at the organ. It might have been the light, or memory, or both pretending to be each other. That evening, back in my flat, I poured a small whiskey and played a Bach record again, though slower this time. The music seemed to drift differently, no longer towards heaven, but inward, to the place where Oxford keeps its secrets. I thought of Margaret in Cornwall, her quiet exile by the sea of bracken somewhere beyond reach, her guilt folded into prayer, and of the organist, who had written his own requiem long before death found him. When the record ended, I didn't lift the needle. I listened to the hiss of the turntable, the low pulse of emptiness that follows all sound. It reminded me of that chapel, its quiet, not an absence, but a presence, patient and unending. The case was closed in the files, though it never closed in on me. Some truths are not meant to be sung aloud. They exist only in that final interval between the breath between music and silence, where nothing can be proven and everything is forgiven.